Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. It's the book festival. It's so good to see all of you here, and so good to have Elizabeth McCracken here with us. I couldn't be happier to see an author. Welcome to Prairie Lights. I'm Kathleen Johnson with Prairie Lights, and today I am happy to welcome you to the Iowa City Book Festival and Prairie Lights. And I'm particularly happy to welcome Elizabeth McCracken back to Iowa City. She's here to talk about her new novel, The Hero of This Book. The hero of this book is a story told in the first person by a narrator who the author makes clear is not her. Thankfully, she stays present with us throughout the book. Kirkus describes the novel by saying, braided into McCracken's gorgeously spiraling narrative is an expansive meditation on the act of writing and, intriguingly, the art of writing memoir. The novel assumes a hybrid quality that could be called autofiction, but really is an homage to the art of great storytelling. Novel, memoir, who cares? It's a great story, beautifully told. Author Rumen Alam says, the question of what this work is, a novel or a memoir, a fiction or a fact, can't be answered. It doesn't matter. The hero of this book is tender, funny, heartbreaking, philosophical. Elizabeth McCracken is a writer who always delights, and this is an exhilarating book. So you see how this book is confusing and not confusing, and it doesn't matter, but it must be commented on over and over and over. Elizabeth McCracken is the author of The Souvenir Museum, Bolaway, Thunderstruck, and Other Stories, which was the winner of the 2014 Story Prize and longlisted for the National Book Award. The Giant's House, which was a National Book Award finalist. Here's Your Hat, What's Your Hurry? An Exact Replica of A Figment of My Imagination, and Niagara Falls All Over Again. Did I get them all? She has received grants and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Liguria Study Center, the American Academy in Berlin, the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. She's a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, where she's also been a visiting faculty member numerous times. She currently holds the James Michener Chair for Fiction at the University of Texas at Austin. We're so glad to have her here today. Please welcome Elizabeth McCracken.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be here. I'm going to take off my pocketbook. I've been known to give a reading wearing my pocketbook. I'm so happy to be here. It's hard for me to explain just how much. I'm also going to adjust my accessories. Sorry. There we go. It'll make me a little less sweaty. What Iowa City and Prairie Lights mean to me. I first came to Iowa City 34 years ago. And while I don't think that writers need MFAs to be writers, Iowa is what made me a writer. And I know I have a lot of old friends in the audience, and I would call you out by name except for I'm also really face blind. So they're the people who I know I recognize, but if I don't recognize you, know that once when I saw my husband wearing a hat, he was a stranger to me, and just tell me who you are. As I say, when I came to Iowa, I was somebody who sort of liked to write, and to be in a place where other people told me it was the best thing that you could do changed everything in my life. As it happened, my mother, who we'll talk about, who was an Iowan, and one of the reasons I came to Iowa, besides the obvious reasons, and the obvious reasons were in 1988, there were a small handful of graduate programs in creative writing, and Iowa was the only one I got into in fiction. And it was, you guys might know this, it's got a fairly good reputation as a place to come. to write, and it was one of the luckiest breaks I ever got. One of the other luckiest breaks I ever got is that in my second year, my final year, as a student at the workshop, I won a book prize contest that the prize was $500 worth of books, an unfathomable amount of money for books in 1990, from Prairie Lights. And I came and Paul Ingram largely just put books and books. I said, what should I buy? I'm rich. I'm a millionaire. I'm a book millionaire. And he just stacked books upon me. And he also, which I feel like is something I should say every time I'm in Prairie Lights. Years later in 2001, I came to visit. I can't remember why I was in town. I published a book that year. I actually do remember. That's not disingenuous. I did just remember why I happened to be in town. And he said, I read this really weird book by an Englishman that you are going to like. And he put it in my hands. And 2 years later, I married the guy who wrote the book. But it was the first time I'd ever heard Edward Carey, who is my ball and chain. I'd ever heard his name. And Paul was right. I liked the book. He didn't recommend the author in any particular way, having not met him at that point. So I'm going to read this book, which, as you can tell from Kathleen's lovely introduction, it hedges its bets about what kind of book it is. This napkin is a bit moist. And what I can say about it is that it was a novel when I wrote it. And what it is now, it's a little hard to say. I'm going to read either two. I'm going to look at my watch and read either 2 or 3 places from it. I'm going to start at the very beginning. Sort of one of the pleasures of reading from this book, though I've almost never done it. I never have read from this book as long as I'm doing today, is that it requires very little setup, because I am one of those people that when I go to a reading, it's the same thing as when a waiter brings a plate and says, don't touch the plate, it's hot. And I immediately reach out and touch it. And when a writer says, all you need to know before I read this section is, I stop paying attention because I want to do the opposite of everything that I'm told. So I'm just going to read from the beginning, and I'm going to read a little bit later on too. This was the summer before the world stopped. We thought it was pretty bad, though in retrospect, there was joy to be found. Above ground monsters were everywhere with terrible hair and red neckties. The monsters weren't in control of their powers. The hate crimes, mass shootings, heat waves, certainty, stupidity, flash floods, wildfires, but they had reach. Everybody talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. Turns out we were supposed to. August 2019. I shouldn't be vague, though that's my nature. Things felt dire, which now seems nearly laughable. You could still go unthinkingly go places. Myself, I'd gone to London, where a heat wave had bent train rails and shut down art exhibitions and turned the English into pink, panting mammals. I, pink, mammalian, panted alongside them. I was trying to decide what I thought about my life. On the internet, I'd found a small hotel in Clerkenwell, a neighborhood I hadn't heard of. Clerkenwell, the owner of the hotel clarified when I arrived, but I couldn't get the hang of deforming only the one E and kept calling it Clerkenwell. He was a gentle, blinky Englishman named Trevor, who might have been 30 and might have been 50. He had a shaved head, hoops in both ears. He wore espadrilles, long loose shorts, and a brown linen vest, which he surely called a waistcoat and surely pronounced waistcoat. Altogether, he looked like somebody who was either a vegan or knew how to mindfully butcher a pig and use up every bit, snout and kidneys, trotters and tail. Perhaps you fear writing a memoir reasonably. Invent a single man and call your book a novel. The freedom one fictional man grants you is immeasurable. Here for pleasure, Trevor asked, or is it work? Bit of both, I said finally with an accidental English accent. Trevor smiled. His canines were obelisks. Come this way. You'll like it here. Full of history. They used to hang people on the green. Wonderful, I answered. The usual feeling of having my fortune told came over me as it did whenever I approached accommodation for the first time. Good, I was blessed. Bad, cursed. A short list of my minor obsessions: hotel rooms, fortune tellers, coin-op machines. Embarrassing how much I refer to fortune telling in my life. By life, I mean writing, not memoir. I am not a memoirist. The room at Trevor's was on the ground floor, a curse, but the photos on the website hadn't done justice to the green leather armchair, or shown at all the little desk in the bay window, the old cast iron stove set into the fireplace. Trevor's hand, as he gestured, was knuckly and a tremble. Cooker's original of the house, he said, Georgian. Though there would have been a whole family in this one room, just the 2 nights. Yes, I said, alas. Alas was one of those things I said too often, a way to say no while presenting myself as helpless. He nodded. His eyes, like the chair, were oddly green. I'll leave you to it. The bathroom had a snub-nosed slipper tub and a toilet that flushed with a pull chain. At the bottom of the toilet bowl, in pale blue letters baked into the porcelain, were the words, Thomas Crapper, London Limited. Such a world that has such toilets in it. I put my laptop on the desk in the window and drew the curtains to reveal another pair of curtains, and drew those curtains to reveal a sheer panel attached at both top and bottom. There were pubs on either side of Trevor's place. I could hear the drinking Londoners on the street. Conversation, blunt laughter. 2 men moved in front of the window like burly shadow puppets, inches away from me. I could see their shapes, but not details. Tenerife's no good, one said to the other, bringing his pint glass to his mouth. Tenerife's where I fucked up. I switched on the desk lamp. Its glass shade the same Robin Hood green as the armchair. Peter Pan green, poison green. If the drinkers had noticed me, I would have looked to them like an automatic fortune teller in a box. Go back to Tenerife, I thought at the man outside, and find your true love. Perhaps I'd write this advice on the back of a business card and push it through a crack at the bottom of the window. Never give up your metaphoric bad habits, the way your obsessions make themselves visible in your words. Tell yourself that one day a scholar will write a paper on them, an X-ray of your psyche with all of your quirks visible like breaks in bones, both healed and fresh. I took out the burner phone I owned for international travel, turned it off, and set it on my desk so that I wouldn't be woken up by middle of the night text from America. The one person who might need me, the simmering emergency and joy of the past few years, my mother, was 10 months dead. The last time I'd been to London with her was in 2016, after the presidential election, but before the inauguration, on a lark of a Christmas trip. We'd had an exceptionally good time. I'd only minimally sniped at her. I'd let her make every decision, and I picked up every check. Condoling friends used the words grief and mourning, but neither was what I felt. All my life, I'd heard people use those words to discuss the ordinary deaths of elderly people, or worse, elderly animals, and I am hard-hearted. I found them melodramatic. Those old people and dogs were never going to be immortal. Grief, as I understood it, grief and I were acquainted, is the kind of loss that sets you on fire as you struggle to put it out. My mother's death hadn't changed my mind. I just missed her. I hated to see her go, but she'd had a sweet end, or so I kept telling people, though who was I to speak for my mother? She'd hate that, my opinion about her experience. It was sweet for her family, at home with hospice nurses and cats, and friends around the bed, at a time, 2018, when you couldn't count on a sweet end, but it wasn't impossible. At my Clerkenwell desk, I read an email from the real estate agent who was going to try to sell my mother's house in far-off Massachusetts. A crew of professionals had cleaned it, organized the contents, held an estate sale, and then swept all the leftover things into 3 dumpsters. The estate sale I had attended, the clean out, as it was called, happened afterward over weeks, though I hadn't seen the pictures or heard how much the sale had netted. The real estate agent had grown up in the same Italian-American neighborhood as I had. I was not Italian-American, with the same sort of name as the boys from my elementary school, which is why I had picked him, though he was 10 years older than me and my former classmates, a youngish senior citizen in a blue suit. I didn't know him, a relief. One of my mother's neighbors was keen to sell the house for me, had in fact met my mother while canvassing the street for houses to sell, had in fact emailed me to offer condolences and her services. I was tired of people who'd known my mother getting in touch with me, not because they had no claim, but because they did. In London, I found I wanted to hoard my little portion of her. I didn't write back to the neighbor or to the Russian handyman who worked for my mother and wanted to know whether he should cut the lawn, or to his wife, an enthusiastic though incompetent house cleaner who brought my mother homemade chopped liver and loved her entirely. Mow the lawn? It was a reasonable question. I just didn't want to answer it. I didn't even write back to the real estate agent whose daughter, he said, had taken pictures of the house. The listing would be up by the end of the American day. Let him list the house. Let it disappear without me noticing. It wasn't a haunted house, but a haunting one. It had haunted me a long time. Bereaved. That I'd own up to. Bereaved suggests the shadow of the missing one, while grief insists you're all alone. In London, I was bereaved and haunted. The house was for sale. Soon, I would have nothing to do with it. I didn't want to see the pictures. I didn't want to work either. I closed my laptop and felt the internet burble through the lid, felt it flow into my fingers and hectic wrists. The next day, I decided abruptly I would spend the whole day out, just my internetless burner phone in my pocket. I would let the city fill my whole head, and I would be a person on the earth instead of on the internet. I love the internet, no mistake. The natter, the burble, the possibility of offered love, the opportunity to ask for love and receive it, never unalloyed, perhaps only fool's love, shining like the real thing, which sometimes was good enough, even if it didn't last so long. The thrill of finding fool's love was still a thrill. The internet, or my relationship to it, had become a sixth sense, a shitty one, a power I used to divine things, sure, but also a prickling sensation in my organs. There's information out there. Better find it. The monsters, too, whose power lived in the way they convinced you that you could defeat them with words they'd never read. I had a fantasy that someday I would meet one or two of these monsters, shake a hand, lean forward, and whisper the one thing each would most hate to hear. You do know you're going to hell, fat ass. Everyone can tell how stupid you are. God doesn't love you. Your wife doesn't love you. Your children will forget you. You're going to hell. You're going to hell. You're going to hell. As for myself, I didn't believe in hell or an afterworld of any sort. What netherworld could be more nether than this one? I believe the afterlife was, as an atheist might tell a child curious about heaven, the memories of other people. How my mother would have hated that. To cede control to other people's brains when her own brain was what she trusted. Still, she loved being thought about. You know, said the man on the other side of my window, the one who'd fucked up in Tenerife. That's how it is. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. But do you know what I mean? My mother distrusted memoirs, and I wasn't interested in the autobiographical. And for a long time, that made things easy. But writers change, even if mothers don't. Mothers change plenty. Don't trust a writer who gives out advice. Writers are suckers for pretty turns of phrase with only the ring of truth. I'm going to read just one other section from, because it's a Iowa City one, and I hope I don't look like the Nazi melting in Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is how I feel with water running down my face. I feel serene and happy to be here inside for some reason. Oh, thank you, Kathleen. I haven't read this part, but it seems like the right part to read. I mean, I read it when I wrote it a couple of times afterwards. Let's see what's in here. I haven't read it aloud. I assure you, I have vetted everything I'm about to read to you. In the spring of my first year of graduate school, my grandmother brought one of her younger sisters from Florida to live in Des Moines. It was a relocation of force. My great aunt had lived in New York for years, was a nonconformist, notably eccentric, even among their 9 other unconventional siblings, had painted the clowns of the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey circus. And when she got to a certain age, she did not run away with the circus, but attempted to retire with it, had moved near the circus's winter home in Sarasota, Florida, where she was unhappy and confused. I went to Des Moines to help unpack boxes, but it was clear my aunt had Alzheimer's, which had killed 2 other sisters, hard in this case to notice because she had been strange and impulsive all her life. Even in Des Moines, my grandmother refused to say Alzheimer's aloud, though she must have suspected that that was the problem. Wanted to protect her sister's privacy, even as my aunt attended social events at the temple and rummaged through other people's purses, agitated that she couldn't find the keys to her Florida house. She had a temper. She yelled at us. I tried to let her yell at me more than at my grandmother because I could take it. She'd never known who I was. All spring, I was back and forth on the Greyhound bus from Iowa City. I couldn't conceive of writing fiction because my head was filled with the emergency that was my aunt's existence. But I had a deadline for workshop. So I wrote about the time with my grandmother and aunt and called it a nonfiction short story. The reception, as I recall, was particularly terrible. What does this even mean? One of my classmates asked. A nonfiction short story? Which is it, fiction or nonfiction? It matters. He wasn't asking me. I wasn't allowed to answer, but the other people in the room agreed that I had done something wrong, something authorially intrusive. Authorial intrusion was seen as a great aesthetic crime in the 1980s. We accused each other of it all the time. Those moments our shadows fell across our fiction. I can't remember why we thought it was so awful. Maybe it was supposed to be a sign of ego. Imagine a writer with a visible ego. The workshop teacher cleared his throat. He was a writer of fiction, but his first book had been a celebrated memoir, and he said, if I know one thing, it's that it doesn't make any difference. Call it what you want. I felt physically grateful, as though I had been given an antidote. All these years and pages later, I still can't decide whether I agree with him. I never showed my grandmother what I'd written about her and her sister, but I dedicated my first book to her, and she introduced me at her temple as the youngest person ever to publish a novel, though there was nothing in that sentence that was accurate except that I was a person. The book was not out yet. It was only sold. It was a collection of short stories, and many younger people had beat me to it. When my grandmother died of a heart attack in her apartment a few years later, getting dressed for the day, my aunt was living in the Iowa Jewish Senior Life Center, formerly the Iowa Jewish Home for the Aged. My grandmother's memory was still in order, only her nerves were frayed. The woman who cleaned for her found her in the early afternoon, lying across the threshold of her bathroom. If she could have done anything different, my mother told friends who asked about her mother's death, she would have finished pulling up her slacks. I finally told my mother to knock it off. If she thought my grandmother would rather not have been found with her slacks down, then surely she would have rather people didn't know she'd been found with her slacks down. We flew out for the funeral immediately. She would be buried within 3 days in the Jewish cemetery next to her husband, dead then 30 years. We had a reception in the community room of my grandmother's apartment building, where 2 months before we'd thrown her a party. She'd admitted then that the year's birthday was significant, but she'd never say how old she was. Even her driver's license was wrong. After the reception, my mother and I went down the hallway into the lobby. We were headed to the elevators to my grandmother's apartment on the 3rd floor. It's been years now since I've seen it, the way my mother walked with canes, deliberately, with kind of a hitching grace, picking up one cane and setting it down, then the other. I can see it, though I can't describe it or explain it in the way that before Muybridge, nobody knew exactly how horses ran. Once I saw a young woman decades younger than me walking through a Target in the exact same hitching way and tears sprang as though from a spring to my eyes, and I wanted to follow her until I realized what a fucking creep I was. In my grandmother's lobby, a little old lady sat on the colossal, tufted, four-sided sofa facing us. I don't know whether it was the same old lady who was always sitting in the lobby or whether she was occasionally replaced like an ornamental plant. She called out to my mother, "What happened to you, sweetheart?" People ask this all the time. To them, my mother's body itself asked the question, and it was her duty to answer it. Polio? Car accident? She had made them notice her, and now she had to explain why. Without looking at the old woman, my mother said, "Cerebral palsy," and headed to the elevator. My mother was then 58 years old. I was 26. I had never heard her say the words cerebral palsy, not to describe herself, and for a moment they struck me as a solution to something I hadn't known was a puzzle. She'd never used those words before, I understood, because my grandmother hadn't liked them, even though the words my grandmother used, birth injury, meant the same thing. The injury, if there had been one, was the event. Cerebral palsy was the result. But my mother hadn't used the words even miles away from my grandmother's hearing. Now my grandmother was dead, and my mother could describe herself any way she liked. I can guess why my grandmother didn't like the phrase. If there was an injury, then there was an injurer, a person, the doctor, who was at fault, somebody other than my grandmother herself. My grandmother was 32 when my mother and her sister were born, old to become a mother back in 1935. Even my grandmother cannot outrun birth records on the internet. Old enough to have increased her chances of twins, old enough that the birth could have been tricky. My mother had a birth injury or pre-birth injury. My aunt had congenital heart problems. It could only be, my grandmother might have thought, even when I knew and loved her, she was full of self-recrimination, my grandmother's fault. Or else, she didn't like anything with the air of a diagnosis, anything that might reduce her multitudinous darling to a medical term. After that, my mother was never shy with the words. If this were a memoir, it isn't. The author might talk at length about her own connection to her grandmother on the subject of self-recrimination, how easy it is to blame yourself for the harm that comes to children during pregnancy, and how other people, even well-meaning ones, will blame you too. It isn't. She won't. No book can contain everything. I'll stop there. Sorry, having not read that before, I was like, that is a real bummer with no text on. So I will try to be cheerful and entertaining in answering your questions.
It was the kind of bummer that we like from you. Who has a question? Just raise your hand and I will bring the microphone over to you.
Hello. My question is, can you talk about the discovery of the narrative voice of this book? Seems very specific. How did it come about?
Yeah, I mean, it comes from two different things. Hi, Liz. Thanks for asking the question. And one is probably a strange thing to say, but from Twitter. I am one of those people who still very much enjoys Twitter. I like Twitter. I've been on it since 2008. And I have realized just recently, I mean, in the past month or so, that I would never have written this book without spending time making up a sort of version of myself who's not myself, and that is sort of interested in one-liners and being publicly crabby. And that before that, I don't think I could have written something. I mean, I once read a memoir that's quite personal, but in this case, yeah, I think I couldn't have sort of had fun with the voice. The other thing that happened in the writing of the book is that in order to trick myself into writing this book, because I always have to trick myself into writing books, I decided that there was going to be a novel, and then there were going to be a ton of endnotes and footnotes to it, and those were going to be sort of a writing manual. And when I was writing that, I made a decision quite early on that when I teach creative writing, which I have done it at Iowa now, in Texas, and I've done it in other places for, decades. I'm pretty nice. I'm really mean about titles. I frequently tell students that they're bad at titles, but otherwise I'm very kind, and rigorous but kind. And I spend a lot of time equivocating and saying, you might want to do this, or I think that, or I want students to make their own decisions. And I don't like to. There are very few things that I believe are true that maybe nothing that fiction must do. But I equivocate a lot, and I decided that when I was writing the notes to this book that I was not going to do that. I was going to write what I really felt, which was, you should do this, and I'm right about this. And so there is a sort of like this, a streak of extreme crabbiness about the process of writing, because I realized that the notes didn't work. And they partially didn't work because there was this novel, and then there was like, 40 pages of me being a crank about stuff, which I really enjoyed writing. I enjoy being a crank. But when I realized they didn't work, I put maybe 10% of the observations about writing the first draft. The narrator was not a writer. And then she became one when I sort of worked stuff in at the end.
One of the things that I particularly liked was your wrestling with back and forth, or your characters wrestling rather, of whether or not it is okay to write about one's parents. And how did you feel differently at having written this novel, not memoir, novel, than you felt starting out? Did you earn it? Did you feel?
I've earned nothing in my life. It's a good question. And the fact is, which I forget with anything that I write, that beforehand I'm full of terror and worry. I'm concerned. I wonder what people will think. I worry about what people will think that they know about me. And I try to put it away when I'm writing. I'm pretty good at putting it away when I write. And then I publish the book, and I do not give a damn. Not one good goddamn. At the end, it's like, it's fine. Whatever it is, the book is out of my body. It's over there. And people can make of it what they want, including even relatives of mine. I did come to the conclusion that I think my mother, and it is a novel. It says so on the cover, so it has to be, right? Otherwise, I could get sued. But the character.
Can your mom do that? I mean, I know she was a force.
Yeah, no, I don't think she could or she would. Though I did. There's only one living person in this book who has a name. My friend Marguerite White, who was very good to my parents and really looked after them when I was far away from Boston. But it would be disingenuous for me, besides the fact that my mother is named at one point in the book. Actual mother was, she's unmistakable. Like it would be horrible to say, this is a character who just happens to be a 4'11" Jewish woman who's a twin from Des Moines, Iowa, with cerebral palsy, who has who talks like my mother. It's my mother. I will acknowledge that. But also making the decision that it was a novel. I made the decision that it was a novel before I wrote it. I didn't write something and then decide what I felt. And I think it gave me the freedom to write what I wanted to write about my mother without hearing her whispering in my ear. And my conclusion, and I'm thrilled to say the conclusion of people who know her, who have read it, is that she would really like it. She loved being the center of attention. And the idea of a book about her, there's a few things she would have said, I would never give you permission to write about that and put it in the book. And my answer would be, you know what I didn't put in the book. You should be happy.
You're right. Waffle irons really aren't that private.
Yeah, waffle irons are not that.
Okay. This has nothing to do with what you read, but what's a bad title? When you said the students make terrible, what makes a bad title?
I I'm trying not to give you specific examples, but I hate generic titles. I hate titles that could be. I have a student who you will hear of him in the next few years, who named Ricky Fain, who wrote a book entitled "The Sins of the Father," and I was like, cannot title a beautiful literary novel about well, just really anything about with such a generic title that's been the title of a million different things. But I will say, and I will say this because the student of mine would actually love it if I said this. The brilliant novel that came out last year by Nathan Harris that got a huge amount of acclaim. It's called The Sweetness of Water. And I worked really hard to get him to change that title. And when I see him, he says, "Yeah, I know you hate the title. Didn't hurt the book." I know. But I wrote him at one point and said, "It sounds like an," and again, I would just like to make clear, I love Nathan, and this book is so beautiful and brilliant. But I think the title sounds like an airport shop in the Atlanta airport, is my feeling, The Sweetness of Water. And again, like Nathan would endorse me saying this in public.
Other questions?
Hello. So I'm a second year in the workshop, and I'm so curious to hear about your writing process from, like, what do you think are the most significant changes that have happened with your work from the first major work that you finished around the time that you left here to now and the work that you're doing?
It's a good question. How's it going?
It's going.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about, and I've got friends who I was in the workshop who are here, and I think I was quite stubborn and bloody-minded when I was here, and even so, I absorbed a lot of advice that people told me definitively, and I think actually they were mostly not from my teachers, but from my fellow students. Authorial, like, you can't. This is authorially intrusive. That's terrible. And now I sort of think, no, that was just what I wanted to write, and that's all right. And the big difference, I think, is that, and I feel like this is the point of being a writer, is that the older I get, the more I try to throw off any constraint I ever put in my work, and that I know that I write best, and that my work feels better, and that I generally, other people, I think, seem to think so, when I'm writing without constraints and without rules, and I'm figuring out a way to be sort of fluid and write what I want to, and then I go back, not to put constraints in, but to sort of see, to try to figure out what I meant when I was writing the first draft. But it was strangely hard for me to throw off some of those things that I didn't even realize I had taken on from the advice. And again, I think I had Alan Gerganis as a teacher my first semester, and he was astonishing. And usually anybody who knew Frank Conroy will recognize him as the writer I mentioned. And I didn't name him because, again, I have named almost nobody in the book except for my mother and Marguerite. But my classmates sometimes, not that nobody's here. I'd like to make clear. that guy. I'm not pointing at anybody real. I'm pointing over my shoulder. I've gotten I've gotten more grandiose in my own writing in a way that I think is useful.
There's a big concern right now with omniscience and who gets to tell the story. And yeah, I have noticed with peers especially, and perhaps it's because they're we all are, but in various degrees, still learning, like what can we do and how can we tell the story? Is this okay? And then some people are more timid with the process, and others are like, I'm just writing my story. I've known what it is for a bit, so leave me alone. And yeah, it's sort of interesting to see not how we battle it out, not that that's not a good term, but discuss and debate.
Yeah.
And who is the speaker of, and where is the, where are the actions coming from? Who's narrating and
Oh, man.
from the ceiling, or is it on the floor? Is there a
Oh, you guys have to stop that. Can I say, stop talking about that, because, I mean, this is actually something I feel very strong about. First, I feel like, first of all, you're allowed to do anything that you want to. And there is only one great rule of switching points of view and omniscience, which is that it has to work. And that is the only rule that there is. And that when you get obsessed with writing an omniscient point of view about where ideas and thoughts are coming from, it's like dancing while looking at your feet. You're not going to accomplish anything sort of meaningful and artistic if you are hyper aware and you're asking those questions. I remember hearing people say, who's the third person narrator and what do they know? And my answer is always, the third person narrator is not a person and knows nothing. A third person narrator is a gaseous invertebrate. And that gaseous invertebrate can go anywhere that it wants to. And again, different third person narrators have different properties. It's like what the author decides about what kind of minds they can go into. But like, if you just think of my favorite living short story writer, Edward P. Jones, you cannot map what point of view does in his stories. He goes into somebody's head because he needs to go there. And he always takes the reader with him so that you understand. But if you brought an Edward P. Jones story into any writing workshop and people started asking that, people would lose their minds, because it's not mechanical. It's artistic.
We did have an Edward P. Jones story in workshop.
Did it make people crazy?
A little bit.
What's one thing that you make a point to teach your students aside from the title?
Besides being really horrible about titles. I do, the big thing that I feel about fiction writing is that there are no universal rules for fiction, and that when stories or novels fail, it's because they break the rules that the piece of work itself is set up. It's like you can't follow the point of view, you can't track the psychology of characters. Suddenly time is moving in a way and leaves the reader behind. And that as a teacher of creative writing, like, my job is to make people think the most interesting things that they can, and then they teach themselves to write the work that only they can write. That's one thing. And the other thing I always tell the graduate students is make friends with the hardest working writers you know, because you will try to catch up to them, and that is good.
So how is writing in Texas different than writing in Iowa? For you personally?
Texas. Not that Iowa does not have its small issues these days. Yeah. Like, just between Texas and Iowa, just go, yeah, Texas, yeah, Iowa. I think one of the things that I have liked about living in Texas, although I've also learned this lesson, so I'm eager to leave Texas because I've really got it down now, is I actually really love the way, and I think this is a little similar to Iowa, Texans talk about being Texans. They're very serious about home and having an identity. I interviewed a former student of mine named Kim Garza, who has a beautiful first book out, and she was talking about being a Texan writer and saying, I knew that, like, I would have to, I didn't know that somebody like me could be considered alongside other Texas writers like Cormac McCarthy and Laurie McMurphy. Like, is there a place in Texan writing for somebody who's like me? She is the child of Mexican and Filipino immigrants. And I was doing a Q&A with her, and I unpleasantly, because it's a really interesting and important question, but I also burst out laughing because I was like, I'm from Massachusetts. No Massachusetts young writer goes, well, I measure up to Hawthorne and Updike, because we just don't think about writing. We don't think about our state the way that Texans think about their state. We don't think about there being a literature of Massachusetts or even a literature of New England if we're trying to mass together and still be way smaller than Texas. But I really, and I still find it really puzzling when people say, I'm a fifth generation Texan, and I'm always going, do you know it's a state, right? Like the other states. And my standard joke is the fight song of Texas is the eyes of Texas are upon you, and that the fight song Massachusetts is the eyes of Massachusetts are politely averted. But I think that I have thought about myself and geography and place and setting in a completely different way that I have really loved and I think has been useful to me since moving to Texas, because I think beforehand, sorry, that's my phone that's making that noise. Because I think beforehand I didn't think about setting all that much, or if I was interested in it, I would write about it. And now I'm just sort of always aware in anything I write.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like it's more situational for you when you're upset, you're trying to write about your fiction, nonfiction that causes so much controversy in workshop. Question over here.
I just kind of like a fun question. One of my favorite lines from your book is like, I have no interest in ordinary people, having met so few of them in my life. Can you describe the most ordinary person you've met?
No. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. When I was in the workshop, I had a bunch of family in Des Moines, living family in Des Moines, my grandmother and cousins and aunts and Mishpaka. And at one point, my friend Karen Edelman drove me to Des Moines and dropped me off and met like two of them. And when she came back, she said to our friends, you think Elizabeth doesn't write realistic fiction, but I have met her family. She writes very realistic fiction. And that is sort of my stance in general. I think real people are so much stranger and complicated and interesting and irritating and lovable and full of rage and full of doubt and love than most fictional characters, and that we generally believe. I think we are all made of our eccentricities, and I think that the most ordinary person I've met, this sounds terrible because it sounds like something that should be on a poster or like embroidered. The most ordinary person I met is somebody I just don't know yet. But I do think, I don't think I've ever known anybody who there's not some genuine weirdness at the heart of.
And you just tease it out of us one by one. Well, I wonder what you would tell people. I know we have a few writers in the audience about books that are written but not published. What would you say to others about how they might feel about them? Not about you.
Join the club. I'm a really inefficient writer, and I have a couple of novels that I have never published. And I actually have one that I wrote relatively recently during the pandemic. I was on leave for a semester, and my husband and I rented a little store working space because our house was too small for us to be teaching and kids to be taking classes. And I was on leave, so I wasn't teaching, and I knew that I would be furious at myself if I didn't get a lot of work done. So I finished this book, which I had a draft of, and I wrote another very small novel, and I will go back to that. But I have a couple of novels I haven't published, and I haven't looked back at them because I'm sort of nervous that either they would be so dreadful or that there would be enough that I was interested in that I would slog away at them again. And the one thing that I would say, besides the fact that I know that there are many amazing stories about people who, one of them, a student of mine at Iowa, Paul Harding, who took, I think, 6 years to find an agent and an editor for his first astonishing book, Tinkers, which then went on to win the Pulitzer Prize, but he had a really hard time finding people to have faith in it. And then once it was out in the world, readers instantly responded. Like, it was instantaneous that people loved it. And so I do think for unpublished books, my biggest advice is not to revise them to make them seem more publishable. It is better to write a book that you believe in and not publish it than to write a book you don't believe in and not publish it. And it is possible to write a book you don't believe in and publish it is the worst thing of all, even though it might not seem that way. And also to remember that no writing is wasted, and that having written anything that you write will inform your work thereon.
Well, other than Edward P. or in addition to Edward P. Jones, are there any authors that you read that just make you feel like alive and excited about writing?
Oh yeah, a lot. I was actually, the first person I'll mention is Yun Lee, because I just saw her and did an event with her for her amazing book, The Book of Goose, and we were at dinner beforehand. We were talking about what contemporary writers we were really reading, and I mentioned Edward P. Jones and also Jeanette Winterson, whose work I just absolutely adore. And now I'm doing that. It was handy that we had that conversation, because whenever anybody asks me any questions, I think, Kathleen, I've never read a book. I remember no books ever having read a book. And I should just I feel like I should get a tattoo on my forearm. So I remember, because sometimes I remember the same 3 people I've been saying for 30 years, Carson McCullers, Grace Paley, and Dickens. But I should.
Sorry, that was kind of a generic question.
No. I'm just, it's a good question.
Are there any books that your kids read that make you excited about writing?
Well, my daughter Matilda is going to be Hercule Poirot for Halloween. I have, with my friend Wendy, secured a false mustache for her at the theatrical shop in Des Moines. She's into Agatha Christie and Dumas, and also into Heartstopper, the graphic novel series. And Gus read? He reads a lot of nonfiction and reference books.
Curious.
Yeah.
All right, other questions?
I'm sorry to take up all this space. No, I'm not actually. My question is about time, about how some stories might take time. And I wonder, was this book, I mean, you've had a mother your whole life. Was this book something you were always kind of writing in your head, or no? And would you have been able to write this book at the beginning of your career, or did it need time?
No, I needed time. Because I really promised the inscription on this is a photograph of my first book inscribed to my mother for Mother's Day. It's the first time I ever inscribed a book to anybody, I'm pretty sure, in which I promised her that I will never write about her. And I did not remember this inscription until I had finished writing this book. And then weirdly, there was an estate sale, and I got an Instagram message from a stranger who said, I'm staying in this hotel that decorates things with books, and I pulled this down and I found this book with this inscription in it. And somehow the book had gone from the estate sale, had been sold as a lot to a hotel that decorated with books without jackets on it. And I think I couldn't have written about her. I think part of it is that sort of that question of being unconstrained, because the question of whether it's a novel or a memoir, even before I wrote it, I thought for a moment, well, if it's a memoir, it has to do this. If it's a novel, it has to do this. And which way would I go? And then I realized, why? If it's a memoir, it has to do this. And if it's a novel, it has to do that. Like I can do what I'd like to. I don't think I would have done that at the beginning of my career. I don't think. And then as I say, I made the decision that it was a novel. Yeah, I did not think about writing a book about my mother until she was dead. And this is in the book. One of the reasons why I did it is because when somebody dies, writing is a way to keep them close for a while. Not that it's like this really loving, wonderful thing. It's really something slightly nasty about it. But it's what I did to try to remember my mother. And I'm very aware, I was aware of this when I wrote a memoir too, that when you're writing autobiographically, every month that passes, you'd write another book. It'd be a completely different book with distance. And this is the book that I wrote about a year after my mother died. If I'd written one right afterwards, it would be different. If I wrote one now, it would be different.
Any other questions? All right, well, Elizabeth McCracken will be happy to talk with you and sign copies for books for you. That was a terrific talk. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, Kathleen.
And thank you all for coming.